All right, hello everyone. This is Paul of Fever, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and I am pleased to start up this week's webinar where we're going to be talking, or I should say our guest speaker, Justin Elliott, is going to be talking about Git. Justin is what I like to refer to as a Git expert and a longtime Xojo developer as well. So he has the perfect set of tools to help us Xojo developers use Git effectively. So without further ado, Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate this. First, I have to call out to Kem. He always corrects me on his last name. I always say it wrong. I'm sorry, Kem. Tekene, because he helped me cutting down the massive amount of slides that I had for this presentation. So there will still be a lot of slides. That's the beauty of having the session or this presentation recorded. So if I speak fast and there's a lot of content, that's why the Xojo YouTube channel is very handy. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump in and start to keynote here. So today I'm going to be talking about the basics of Git and using it, which is a source code management system with your Xojo projects. So this is the basics. I had a lot of advanced stuff that's thrown in there, and in talking with Paul, we might be able to do a part 2. So we're going to call this one part 1 of 2 for getting to know Git. So today will be the basics. So let's go ahead and jump in. As Paul mentioned, I'm a developer. I'm also an IT manager. Don't hold that against me. But I've been developing with Xojo and its predecessors for over 10 years, and it's been a fantastic experience. I've been using Git for managing my Xojo projects, as well as other scripts and tools that we use here at Penn State University. Before using Git, I was using Subversion for many years as well, so I was familiar with source code management tools, of a different type. So I have some experience with source code management systems. So what is version control? So basically, version control is a method or a management system that is used to track revisions of your documents, such as source code, scripts, and any text files. You can also store binary files and other things in your repository, but Git particularly excels very well at managing text files, which is fantastic for Xojo projects. Version control also provides the ability to check out the documents and different versions of them. And you think, well, why would I want to do this? Well, it's very handy to manage versions that are publicly distributed already of your software to your customers or end users or your company. And then also allows you to review differences of what you made on the changes that you made, which are also very handy to find bugs and or for release notes and all sorts of other aspects like that. You'll often hear version control called VCS, so obviously that's short for version control system. Something else you also may hear of, just to be familiar with the term, is source code management, or also the acronym SCM. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit of why you should use source code management, and I thought the same thing too, because in a lot of ways I'm a single developer, and I thought, well, source code management is really only for teams, right? No, it's for teams, of course, but it's not only for them. I actually use it on my home machines and my home projects for scripts and other programs that I use and develop for home and for work, and it's been hugely liberating to enhance the ability to move quickly with development. It allows you to take risks, and then you don't worry about, I just overwrote my production code, and you also no longer have to worry about duplicating your code and projects into multiple folders. And who used to do that by a show of hands? Just kidding, of course. I did that for years. I know a lot of people did, and Git particularly will help you no longer have to worry about that. So I can't, obviously I'm a Git fanboy, and I think I've probably sold that probably too much, but it's definitely also excellent for collaborating with others. Just a quick thing, of course, today is really about Git, but for those who are still using Subversion, Git, I wasn't sure about either at first. I read a great article by Joel Slosky, who was actually talking about Mercurial, but also was very similar to Git. The checkouts in Git are much faster than Subversion because each client that has the repository has the full repository history and files. That sounds like, that would be pretty large, but it actually isn't. Git's very good at compressing data. It is also distributed versus centralized. So that means the beauty of that is you are not reliant on a centralized server, always having access, rather, to a centralized server for the master repository. Of course, having the server in a remote, Git calls refers to the remote host as a remote. It's essential, or I would highly recommend always having a remote and then pushing your file changes there. But Git doesn't require you to have a server either. You can use it completely on a standalone machine with no server at all. But anyway, since we want to jump more into Git versus Subversion, I'll wrap up here. It's easier to ignore files and edit other properties. You don't have .svn folders or directories in every subfolder. Git is fantastic at renaming and managing renaming and moving of files that you have not modified themselves. This is a huge benefit because in Subversion I was lazy or didn't want to take the time, or it was tedious to move files and directories around the structure. In Git, you can move directories around and files, and as long as you didn't change the file at the same time, but merely changed its name or moved it, Git says, oh, that's the same file, no problem, I understand, and it treats it like a file system internally. And lastly, branching and merging in Git is much easier. I read this multiple times and I thought, yeah, right, sure it is. It actually is. I was surprised. That was one thing that Subversion can branch, but most people in Subversion, at least I didn't do it too often because it was tedious. All right, so Git, of course, is a great source code management tool. As we mentioned a few things, it's extremely fast performance. It was so you'll find checking in, checking out is very fast. And hold on, I'm sorry, my phone is beeping at me. Apologies. All right, and it has excellent data integrity. So what does that mean? That means that unlike other management systems that use modification dates and tracking of other data on files, Git checksums everything that you have tracked and told it to track or keep track of. It uses the SHA-1 hash, and it's extremely fast because of this. So it knows if anything has changed. So it's extremely efficient with storing data and only the changes that it has detected. Git can be rather intimidating at first because if you look at the documentation, there are so many different levels to it. In fact, I myself had to stop and felt overwhelmed when I first looked at it. But it's actually very easy to learn and to start small. And with utilities like SOURCETREE, which is a GUI client application for Git, that makes it super simple. Then you can later, once you get comfortable with source code management in general and Git particularly, you can, of course, jump into the more advanced features, which we'll cover in part 2 of this Git presentation, which is probably a couple of months. All right, we talked about how Git's distributed. All clients have the full repo. If multiple clients have it checked out, then they have a full backup. Git works completely locally. You don't have to use a server. It stores the repository there. You don't have to keep pushing back and forth to a server until you're ready to update the server if you want. You don't need the server, but again, if you use one, it can be delayed and queued up and pushed later. And yeah, full backups are all on each client, so that's a huge benefit as well. And a lot of people like to hear that about Git. All right, so how to install it? Most of the time, you'll just download an application, a Git GUI client such as SOURCETREE, which we'll use today. The methods apply for all of the other Git GUI clients, but we're going to focus on SOURCETREE today. Or you could also install it as the command line tool, which is included with OS X's Xcode development environment, or you can download it from the URL displayed above, or with a quick Google as well. On OS X, you'd use the terminal.app. Windows, you would end up using the Git bash as well. I've used Git, I should mention, on Windows, Linux, and OS X. I primarily develop on OS X, but it's worked very well on, as well, Windows and Linux, of course, too. I wanted to mention Windows because some people think, oh, Git is only for Linux or only OS X. Nope, it's actually on all 3 platforms, very well supported. All right, so I'll jump into the demo here. After we do a few more slides, we'll jump to a demo and talk about this part. So for Xojo to support, which will really work well, the source code management tools, you'll need a version that is called version control ready. That type of license is a desktop, multiple desktops, not the single desktop, the web pro or the enterprise version. Then you'll set, and I'll show you, of course, how to do this. You'll set the default project format to text. You don't want to use binary and XML because they're really not intended for source code systems. Some folks would say, well, you can still store binary data and things in source code. Yep, you can, but text is a much better way to store it for source code versioning software because it's much easier to see the differences and much more efficient to store in the repository. So what is a repository? We keep talking about this word. Basically, in the context of Git, it's a folder that contains all of the data that Git requires to track the history of your changes. It's a dot, and so the second bullet here is basically repeating the first one in a roundabout way. There's basically a .git hidden directory, which I'll show you here in the Finder. The beauty of Git and SourceTree and Xojo is you really don't need to go to the command line. But one thing I want to mention today, of course, is that I'm focusing on GUI tools today. Some folks may say, oh, I wanted more command line. Why did you show all this GUI? Then you'll have the opposite side that says, oh, I wanted a GUI tool, and you showed me all the command line. So today I'm focusing more so on the Git, on the GUI application side. And that's the nice thing, too. So that you can use the GUI, and you don't have to jump into the command line at all, unless you want to. That being said, it's still good to know the command line in case you want to learn more, as tools don't provide additional features, which we'll cover here in a minute. SourceTree, though, again, it's a fantastic GUI application. I've been using it for a while. If you've been following me on Twitter, I'm a huge fan of it and Git in general, but it's been a very good tool. I'm surprised it's free, but it is. It works very well on OS X and Windows. Not for Linux, but Linux has other options, of course. It also integrates very well with GitHub, Bitbucket, Kiln, Stash, all of the various source code, Git hosting repository services. And it definitely helps to simplify more complex tasks. So SourceTree is highly recommended. It's free. And there are others out there as well. I know Tower is out for OS X. And there might be some others as well. There's Git, CollabNet makes Git I. I've been using that on Linux a little bit. So anyway, SourceTree works very well on both OS X and Windows. So that's the one we're going to focus on today. Again, the methods that we'll use or demonstrate in it also apply to other GUI clients. The other thing I want to mention is the repository that we'll create today with SourceTree can be used in any other Git GUI client. It is not required that you keep using Git for managing that repository. And there's a bug on my desk. Apologies. Okay. All right, it's gone. Okay, so the Git repository creation. It's very easy to do in Git GUI clients. We're showing command line here in the slide, but that's not required for today. Again, you don't have to jump to the command line. I'll demonstrate that here in SourceTree. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in to the configuration and create a repository demo. Jump out. Inside the repository. Okay, so I'm going to cheat. Of course, I have a slide here for myself. Feel free to read it. Nothing secret there. We're not going to install to get SourceTree because it's already installed. I'm not going to bore you with that, and then we'll download them. So I know everybody can use Google, but essentially, if you go to SourceTree.app.com, you can find the various versions. This one's, of course, auto-detecting them on running on OS X. And now let's configure Xojo for text. So I'm going to launch Xojo at this today. It's 2014 R2.1. And we'll just create a desktop. We'll say migrate app. Click OK. Wait for that to fire up. Okay, now you need, of course, a paid account or license for this. And under preferences, I've already got to set the text, but the only thing you need to change here is under General, Default Project Format, and save it as text. Now you're probably wondering, wait, I already have some other projects that are saved as binary or XML. You can change this once you get the license. Allows you to enable text for saving your format. You can resave those projects as text and then add those to a Git repository and track them from there on. It's very easy to do. All right, so now we will name and email address. So now the next thing you want to do that SourceTree handles very well is to configure your name and email address for Git. It requires that because when you do a commit, it needs to list the name and the email address of the person who made the change. And then we'll create the repo in SourceTree. So I'm going to go ahead and quit out Xojo for now. And we'll fire up SourceTree. Now this is if we're completely new. And there are no bookmarks here. Bookmarks, again, are just bookmarks similar to a web browser, keeping track of repositories that we've created. Under SOURCETREE, I'm going to go to Preferences. And notice how the full name and email address are both empty right now. I'm going to type in my name and my email address. Tab's not working. Come on. jde6@psu.edu, and that's it. I'm going to save that. Now I want to allow SOURCETREE to modify the global Mercurial and Git configuration files. Mercurial is the other system that SOURCETREE obviously supports. Here's the Git tab, and we can talk about those options later. We don't need to worry about that right now. So that's how you that's all you need to do to set up for SOURCETREE. If you didn't set it up that way, it would ask you later to enter that information when you did a commit to the repository. All right. Now let's create a repo. Click on it looks like a cylinder. You probably can change and show names as well. Here we go. I'll click on the Add Repository icon, and I'm going to say Create a Repository. I'm going to change it to the Git type, and I'm going to say My Great App. And now here's the default location I told to save, Documents Repository, Git. And we'll go ahead and create. And now it has the bookmark for that particular repository. Now if I say Show in the Finder, it looks like an empty folder. And you might think, well, where's Git storing the information? How is that a repository? Well, it's actually created a .git directory inside of that folder. And I'm going to go to the terminal, and I'll show you so that you see that there's a .git directory right there. Don't go inside that directory. You can look around, but you generally don't want to touch anything in here. This is all being managed by Git. And the way that you back up your entire Git repository is you copy that entire folder. That's it. And then, of course, this is the folder that you would use with other Git GUI clients if you want to manage that with. So you got frustrated with SOURCETREE's user interface changes, which they fixed recently. But if you want to move to Tower or something else, you could tell and point those clients to that folder, and it would say, oh, yep, I see Git. I got all the repository history. I'm good to go. So it's nice and lightweight. All right. And that is how you create the repository. So you're probably thinking, okay, go ahead and show me how to commit a file and all the changes and all that. Well, first, before we do that, we need to talk about a few definitions. So we will do that, I promise. But for now, we're going to show that there's nothing in here, no files. It shows nothing in the directory listing. And that's intentional. So we will get to that next after we cover some definitions. Okay. So some Git terminology, and I'll try not to bore you with terminology, but it's important to know the basics here. So Git has multiple ways of keeping track of files in a repository. If it's tracked, that means you've already told Git to, you want to watch it, and you've added it or committed it, saved it, to the repository. Another kind can be ignored. So there might be large files or sensitive data files or other temporary cache files you want to ignore. We'll show how to do that. Then there's also files that are not tracked. So if it's not tracked or ignored, it's going to show up, and Git will say, hey, there's a new file here. What do you want me to do with it? And that's really good to know because, and that's been extremely handy for me over the years to see that Git, if I create a new Xojo project, I create a new class, and I forget for some reason to add it to the repository, it makes it very obvious. Git will say, hey, here's a new file. What do you want to do with it? You want to track this? Oh, yes, I do. Or ignore it if it's a build folder, for example. So once a file has been tracked, it then understands, keeps track of, okay, has the file been modified? It's been actually, it's still tracked and it's been changed. Or if it's been staged, we'll talk more about that. But that's a phase that you put a file into before the file gets committed. Once it has been committed, that means it has been actually saved into the repository, and Git thereafter says, okay, this file is stored in the repository, it's good to go. And it'll not notify you again, and it'll loop around and say, oh, modified. Now, something important to mention here, thank you, Cam, give me a suggestion here. Where was it? My notifications are turned off, of course, but basically, if let's say that you committed a file to the repository and you said, whoops, I don't need that to be in the repository and I actually want to delete it, you'll actually need to change the status of the file to be untracked. You can easily do that in SOURCETREE. So you would say have SOURCETREE tell Git, untrack this file, make that change. then Git would say, okay, this looks like a new file. I don't know what to do with it. Then thereafter, you could delete it. That can trip some people up, and that also tripped me up initially as well. So good to mention that, Kim. Thank you for the help. All right, so terminology, we mentioned repository. Of course, that's the directory with the .hidden Git folder in it, directory. The working directory basically is just that directory where your files are. That's all that it means. It's pretty simple. The staging area, that's not a file location. That's a Git terminology and a Git file structure. And we'll show what that means and looks like in SOURCETREE. But basically, that's when you edit. For example, you could be working on a Xojo project and you have multiple changes, but some of those changes are standalone. Like this one really only is to a log function versus a new window or something. The staging area, at least for me, helps to say I want to take the first file that is not dependent on other file changes and move that into the staging area. Focus on that, commit what's in the staged area to the repo, and then move on to the next set of file changes. So it's very handy for a workflow. At first, it tripped me up and thought, why do I want to use this? And SOURCETREE and other Git GUI clients actually sometimes hide this by default. They don't use the staging area. You don't need to use it, but I'd say, but for workflow and for encapsulating ideas when you do a commit, it really helps, I think. The Git terminology, okay, so the last Git terminology main one is called a remote. What does that mean? That means the host, if you're using a server to push to, that is called the remote. Again, you don't need servers, but once you start seeing that term, that's what that's referring to. A remote would be like if you had a repository that you're pushing and saving to GitHub or Bitbucket or any one of the other resources out there. So the workflow is basically, you have some files in your working directory. You tell Git, okay, or SOURCETREE, I want to track these, so you add them to the staging area. Once you're done with adding all of the files you want to the staging area, all or just a few, you then commit it and save it to the repository. Then those files are marked as clean, safely stored in the repository. So the basic workflow is pushing from the working directory to the staging area, organizing your thoughts, getting the commit ready, do the commit, and then it's saved into the repository, and you're good to go. All right, so now let's focus a little on ignoring files. Ignoring files, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of files you would want to not have in the repository. Ideally, and it's not critical if you don't do this initially, but ideally it's best to always set up your Git ignores right at the beginning of a project for the obvious files that you're going to want to ignore, such as large files like I mentioned, cache, temp logs, IDE layouts, all of those types of things here too. There are the ignore file paths. You don't need to know that. SOURCETREE actually manages those. They are good to know for the command line junkies out there as well. Now might be a good time, Paul, if you want to post a survey while I get some water.
All right, great. Thanks, Justin. There is one or two questions on the board that you can take a gander at when you get a moment to.
Sure.
All right, let's see here. I'm going to run our standard exciting polls. So let me switch over to that. Our first poll is, what type of apps do you create with Xojo? I'll leave each polls open about 30 seconds or so, or less if you guys are fast on the clicking to answer them. All right, our next question is, do you have a Xojo Pro license? Next is, how long have you been using Xojo? You all are very quick answering these polls. I get records here for speed. And the last poll is, how do you use Xojo? All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Justin.
All right, thanks, Paul. Okay, so I see two, so a couple of questions here that are good ones to ask. Thanks, Kim. So the question is, will create repository work on an existing folder that's already populated with files? I believe the answer is yes. What Git will do is you can tell it to create a repo and point it to and supply a repo name. If the folder doesn't exist or the directory, it'll create it and then creates the .git folder inside of that. It doesn't touch any other items in there. And then when you would check on the status of that using git status or SOURCETREE, it would show all of the files in that directory as all the files in there as new files. All right, so another question we have from Dwayne. Okay, oh, good question. Okay, yep. So the question is basically, how do you handle files that probably won't change? It's just binary files like logos, graphic images, and things like that. I think that's what you're asking, Dwayne. Yeah, those actually store those in Git. It handles them just fine. I've got some images for my applications, the icon files, Photoshop files. So those all can be added to Git, and it can track those just as easily. So there's not an issue there at all. And that's if you want them in the repository, and probably you do. You can also, of course, ignore larger files if you don't want them in. But yeah, you can commit binary image files and those types of files to a Git repository with no problems. And I see a request probably for more console command line demonstrations. We can cover more of that in part 2, sure. Yeah. It depends on everybody's preferences there. We chose to do SOURCETREE and GUI apps today again because we suspected most people are probably in Xojo, the GUI application, and also another one. So it is good to know the command line in case SOURCETREE or others don't work quite right, or you want to get to advanced features that are not yet in SOURCETREE. So yep, I agree. It's good to know the command line as well. All right. So we left off on ignoring files, the path to those files, of course, so that hopefully satisfies some of the console people out there. But again, SOURCETREE is fantastic at managing those for you. And whoops. All right. Okay, yep, so in the ignoring files, the standard things that you can do, some examples are using wildcards to ignore the Xojo UI state, because I don't want somebody else's Xojo UI state if they had in their, they have a 50-inch display and I've got a small 23-inch display. I don't want to be jealous of those state files. So, and then also the builds directory, so you can tell globally for all repositories created in your account on your user's home directory, you don't want the build folder to ever appear and get committed to the repository. You could also use it, of course, in this case, for a large database file or anything else. So those are just obviously some examples. What's not listed here is a path to a directory. You can ignore contents of directories as well. The builds directory actually is. It's just matching a path. You could put a slash on the end of that, and I believe Git would still acknowledge that as a directory. Either way. All right, so adding files to the repo, we talked about this. When you add files, they are staged, and why not just take the files and say commit them right away? Well, again, it comes down to a workflow type of thing. I like the staged area. You don't need to use it, but we mentioned that previously. In SOURCETREE, you would drag to the staging section, which we'll demonstrate here in just a moment. So committing changes is when you're actually writing a comment for the files that you are adding to the repository and committing them or saving them. The commits are very important, that they mean something, have meaning. So and even if you're an individual developer working on just a project yourself in Git, it's not going to help your future self if you put a comment in there that says added files. Well, that doesn't tell you much. It could be, you could link it to a bug report. You can even just put it in as plain English. But as long as it means something and you read the commit and you go back to it later, you'll think, oh, I understand what this means. If it had to fix threading issue, updating the UI was not a good thing, move it to a timer, types of things like that. So commit often, and often means, and now I'm not saying, you add one line of code and then you commit. You don't want to do that. That would be overkill. I usually do commits, and I've talked with others on this too. And the workflow we've all, I think, gotten similar to is that you work for a little bit on a particular small idea or functionality. You get that functionality working. That may be a few different methods or other, and then you commit those. And then you feel liberated and safe that, okay, now I can take more risks, and I know if I need to, I can revert back to that when I know it was working. Don't make the mistake that I made when I was initially using Git and other source code management tools, where I was developing something, I was on a roll, had the caffeine going and the music pumping and all that, and I'm like, okay, I'm really productive. I did 4 hours of changes, no commits, and then I had great stuff and bad stuff. Code changes, and it was a difficult time to separate out what worked and what did not. So just like you're saving documents, you're editing a text file, and Git, save, and commit your changes, so that otherwise, to save yourself the pain of picking them apart later, so that you can pick the gold out of it and then revert when you need to. All right. Viewing differences, it's, as we mentioned, Git is fantastic at viewing the differences. It keeps track of changes in files, and it also is very handy for when you want to go to review them. SOURCETREE and other Git GUI clients have a very decent UIs for showing differences in files, which is nice. We'll show that. There are also other excellent utilities out there, specifically for OS X. I mentioned there are some for Linux and Windows as well. On Linux, I use MELD, M-E-L-D. It works pretty well. And there are others on Windows as well. So you can push basically and configure those applications as the external Git difference engine. And then when you tell Git to compare to, it will launch that particular tool and then show the differences in the pretty user interface that application has. So diffs are pretty handy. All right. So we're going to show how to ignore, stage, commit, and diff the files. So I think I have a notes here as well. So we'll talk about, global and repo only for ignoring files. We're going to do that in SOURCETREE, actually. SOURCETREE, we're going to stage, add files, commit, and show differences of changes. All right, so basically we're jumping into SOURCETREE. All right. So we're back in SOURCETREE. I'm looking at the bookmarks list, the one that we made, that has nothing in it right now. And I want to show that in the Finder. And I'm going to fire up Xojo to create a new basic application. Wait for that to go. I don't mean basic as in basic. I mean as in bare bones. Okay, I'll say my great app. So let's create it. We're doing a desktop for today, but it applies for any of the other ones as well. And again, this is where you want to make sure that your Xojo preferences are set to text. And I'm going to just drag a button in the middle. It's going to do nothing right now. That's just so we can force Xojo to actually let me save the document. All right, so that's it. We're done. I'm kidding. There's more to do. Let's go ahead and save that project. And it might actually already have the project for you because I was doing the test. This is where you would say, double check format says Xojo project, binary and XML. You don't need to double check. I'm just showing you that it's also available from here. The preference setting was for the default for all applications. And we'll say, go ahead and save. Now what that has done is, I'm going to hide the application, go back to the Finder, and now we see that all of these files are in there, separated. So if you're used to saving your projects as binary, you probably saw just one file. This obviously is saving it as separate individual text files. You'll get used to the way that they're named, and I actually prefer them in the text file format now because they're easier to scan and parse. If I left the breakpoint in there and that gets saved, then it's a lot easier to show. We'll show that as well. All right, so now if I go back to SOURCETREE, it says, hey, I see you have some files here. I don't know what these are. That's what the question mark means. I think my global git ignore. Bear with me 1 second. I want to check one of my. Yep, I cheated. I apologize. I'm going to remove these entries from the global git ignore. I want to show you what that looks like in SOURCETREE. It may take a minute to refresh. I'll change the view. Come on. Yeah. All right, we're going to quit SOURCETREE and relaunch. There we go. That's what I wanted to show. Okay. So there's one of the files that we don't want to track, and the .xojo UI state. You could commit it to the repository. It doesn't hurt anything, but that's one of the files you don't want there. One of the other files that your directories you don't want is the builds directory, which we talked about. So I'm going to build the application. Here's my great app. Doesn't do anything right now. quit out of that. Go back to the source tree. And now it shows, hey, I've got this directory and I've got all these files. What do you want me to do with all this? You don't want to add those to your repository. So in source tree, it's very easy to select the item, and we can say ignore. Ignore. Now I want this. You could say this repository only. In some cases, you want that. You want to ignore some files that are specific to a particular repository. It also makes it more portable for others if they don't want to have to edit their global git ignore. But in my case, I want to because I use Xojo every day, as everybody should, and I save and create lots of projects. So I want that to be a global thing to never include the builds folder in any of my Xojo projects. So I'm going to say ignore custom pattern because my great app, the names will vary, but I will remove that. I'll change that to a wildcard, the asterisk, and I will say add that to the global ignores list. So now it's saying ignore custom pattern and add that to the global ignores list. So now any new project, it will not show that folder. And now, source tree, should refresh in a moment. I'm looking for the, all right, we'll go ahead and quit out again. It's being persnickety because, of course, we're doing a presentation. You know how it goes, presentation gods and everything. Let's fire up source tree again. There we go. Okay, now it doesn't show the builds folder, but it's still there. So if we go there, there's a folder, but it no longer shows it in the directory listing. Same thing goes for this one. I think you probably get the point at this point. We'll ignore the custom pattern. I will change that to an asterisk. I don't want to store that. Global ignore list and say OK. Now it immediately ignores those two files. So if I go to source tree preferences, select a git, edit the global ignore list file. You'll see there are two new entries that it put in. I removed earlier. Put everything, all the builds folders and all the Xojo.ui state. Very handy. These two top entries are automatically added by git on OS 10 installers or source tree. Leave those there. All right. Nope. Oops, I quit out. Let's relaunch. Okay. So now is where we're going to drag these and we're going to add these. We can add them one by one, or we can select all of them and add them to what is called the staging area. In source tree, if you want it to look the same way, make sure you have the tree view selected and the split view staging. That's the mode that I prefer to work in. You may prefer otherwise. Use what works for you. And now that they're in the staging area, if I say commit, it brings up at the very bottom and says, okay, I'll say initial commit of project. And I'll say commit. And it's very fast. And then you think, oh, where'd all my files go? Change your view to all files, and you'll see that they're back here as well. So now green means, okay, I am aware of these, Git is aware of those, and it is tracking those changes. And now a master branch has been created. If you click on that, this shows you the history of those changes. So we'll bring it back here and make sure we've got the ignores. We did the global. Now we can do a repo only as well. Source tree. We did the staging, we added files, we committed them, and now we're going to just show a diff of the changes. All right, so in order to do that, we have to edit the application. I should have quit out, and I recommend actually quitting out of Xojo before you do the commit. That was something I should have done. That was just have it moving too fast. All right, it won't hurt anything, but that way you ensure that the application has closed all open files, and then you commit those changes. So one thing to be aware of when you stage files, it is possible to stage a file, then if you make changes to it again, then it will say, hey, that's been changed again since the stage. If you ever see that and you see some weirdness with the staging, just unstage all the files, then re-add it, and then commit it, and you should be good to go. Worst case, you would just have multiple commits, and it would look weird, not weird, but you'd see multiple entries in the history. All right, so I'm going to open up the Xojo project again. And we will now make a small minor change. So I'm going to say, I'm going to add an action event, and just say, hello world. You have to do your hello world thing, of course, right? And then I'm going to go back to the window, and I'm actually going to rename the button. We'll call it hello world ETN. And I'll change the caption to say hello world. Making all sorts of changes here. And we'll move it over. Actually, move the location as well, just to show a bunch of stuff. All right, I'm going to save that. So now it's been saved. And we will run it just to show. Create the build files folder. Right there. Okay, hello world. Right. Put out that. All right. Now let's quit out of Xojo because we want to close all open files. And that's oh, SOURCETREE. All right. It actually did work. We'll quit out of it as well. We'll go back to it. The demo gods are being mean today, but it's been working fine. All right, now it shows, I've selected SOURCETREE to say, all right, I can say show all files. I can say what are modified. You have lots of different views, but it shows all of these, none of these have changed except for window 1. And what's interesting on the right-hand side here, SOURCETREE's built-in diff engine is actually pretty nice. You can change some settings of how many lines relative to it if you want, but you can see very clearly, begin, push button, this is what's been removed or changed, and this is the new change. This is what is now, this is what was before. So the push button, you can see I renamed it to Hello World button. This is where I changed the caption from OK to Hello World, the position, the width, and then the action event here in the Hello World button. So now I'm going to change to pending only, so I don't, and pending means anything that's been modified or untracked. And I would say, yep, okay, I want that to go there. And now it's really handy to have this external diff on the side. You could also use an external diff. In this case, did I configure it? Yes, file merged is by default. This is included with OS 10. This also has another view too here, so you can see the exact same information. The SOURCETREE one is actually very nice. It's built in. It's pretty handy. File view is another one. Kaleidoscope is my favorite on OS 10 if I had to say one. But so you can see the difference. Let's go ahead and do the commit. And I will actually put a good commit, and I'll say changed main window button to hello world. You know, this is not the greatest one. I'm just doing this course quickly. Action event code to display hello world. All right, so I think another miscellaneous thing. So don't ever just put in updated stuff because you'll regret it later. All right, so now that we've changed those, it's been successfully stored into the repository. I'll go back to show all files, and I'll show the master, and now it shows another commit. So the initial one was initial commit of project, which I added all of them that were new, and now it says, oh, okay, you've actually changed this file. This is what was changed, and I have a good change message. So if I ever want to search it, I could say search for hello. Oh, that's why I changed hello. Hello world button, and I can see if that's the commit message or if it's a file change or any other metric I want to use there. But for now, I want to go back to the history, and you can see that it shows the differences of what was changed in that particular commit. So let's jump back to the keynote, make sure we covered everything. The ignores, we talked about the ignores, the repository. We can do a quick terminal. Let's just do it. And now I'm actually in the actual application, which is quite nice, and I can do an echo test. Ignore this file, .text. Okay, .tt, fine. That's good enough. Working copy. Okay, now I can say, ooh, okay, so now there's this file. What do I do with it? Well, I can say, select the file. I want to ignore that. I want to ignore that particular. I want to say only this repository. So it's the exact file name and this repository only. Now, what it's done is it's created a get ignore file for this repository that only applies to this single repository folder. And you want to see that. So now if you say pending, it's going to show that new get ignore file. Drag that in. You could say then created initial get ignore file. And I say commit. And now, any other files, well, I didn't put a wildcard in, but it's going to ignore that particular file. And you can put in paths and other things too. So that's the repository ignore that's specific for the repository only. All right. So I can see what time it is. I know we're running on time. So, of course, we're supposed to be focusing on the basics today. I wanted to add more about, and we'll cover that in part 2. Remote repositories. The difference is, of course, by what we've been working with in SOURCETREE right now. Sorry, I want to get big. There we go. we've only been working with a local repository on my Mac here in the office. I've not yet added a remote, which you could then push to. The remote, again, is either GitHub or another hosting service that you can push and pull changes from, which, of course, upload, pull, download. And if you hear the word clone with Git, that means you're basically copying down the full repository from the hosts. I should mention remote repositories you can access them via HTTP or SSH, all sorts of methods for passwordless secure logins. There's also a Git daemon as well, but I don't recommend using that. I would stick with HTTPS or SSH. You can have multiple remotes as well, which is very handy. I have one, for example, at home. If for some reason my Comcast cable modem is out and I can't get to my work machine, I have a Mac Mini server at home that has SSH enabled, and I push all of the changes to that. Then if Comcast comes back up, it's not out too often, then I can, of course, then when I'm at work, pull from that server from home and get the changes. So it's really nice to have multiple remotes once you get into the advanced stage. You don't need the servers to start with, but they are nice to have once you're more comfortable with it. All right. Let's talk about branches. Branches are more of an advanced thing. You do not need to use them initially. Branches are an isolated line of development. What does that mean? Well, that means that in SourceTree, we've been working on what is called the master branch. The master branch should, typically there's been a workflow that basically says the master branch should always be the line of code that if anybody wants to get it, they can trust it that it's the production version that's out, that is deployed. A branch is another way of having a separate line of code. Essentially, you can think of it as a separate folder if you want, but Git actually handles it as separate changes altogether and does not affect the master branch. So if you're working on version 2.0, a good thing to do would be create a branch for that. Your customers will then have version 1.0 of the software. If you ever reported an error, you could easily save your changes, commit it in version 2 branch, switch it back to the files as they were at version 1, update the fix, make what is called a hot fix, apply it, then merge that change back to your 2.0, and you continue on. So branches are going to be more of an advanced topic. They're not necessarily need to start off right away, but once you get more comfortable with it, I would highly recommend checking out branches because they're very, very handy. And I think I covered these. Master branch, yep, it's the default. In Subversion, you probably heard trunk, similar thing. Git is very good at merging, and Git flow was the branching model that I was referring to. I initially had slides for that in this, was going to show a demo. There would be not enough time to cover that today. So come back for part 2, and we'll talk about Git flow for sure, because it's one of my favorites. I like it quite a bit. All right, so something I want to mention. Now, you should be aware of this warning. If you ever see it in Git, it's not a big deal, but it sounds scary when you first hear it. It says you'll have a detached head. And I don't know about you, but if my head was detached, I'd probably be pretty upset. But in the Git world, it means that there's a reference to the last commit of a branch, and there's a head pointer, or what is called a head reference. So you'll see, what does detached head mean, really? Why is it a problem or not? It's not really a problem, but Git is trying to tell you, hey, you've checked out an old commit. You're not at the latest commit of a branch. Are you okay with this? Because if you make any changes, it's going to try and you'll really want to branch and then merge and do some other changes to that. So it's a way of saying and Git telling you you're not the latest revision or commit of a branch. So if you make changes, then you want to be careful about that. You will see this message when you check out older commits or that you want to test for, you have a bug or something. So it's important to be familiar with that. Tags, I debated on including this or not. It's not, you don't need to use tags right away. Again, they're more useful for advanced topics, but they're very useful for Git bisect, which is a fantastic binary search debugging command tool. It's also very nice to use for, version 1.0 or 2.0 or 3.0, and basically it's just a bookmark for a branch, a commit. So you can say, I gave up version 1.0 to this person or 1.01. I can say, what exactly did they have? The other nice thing about tags is that it's handy to create the tag label with the version of Xojo that you were using at the time and any versions of plugins you have, like Monkey Bread Software 14.2 or 1 or whatever, and Xojo. So I could have named the tags that way. We'll talk more about tags in part 2 of Git and Xojo. But they're there. So remotes, branches, and demos. So the remotes, we're probably not going to have enough time today. That was one that we at the last minute. We wanted to show that, but just only because of time. We can show branches, yep, and reference warning demo, yep, we'll just show that one and create some tags. So we'll have to pick and choose here just because of the time limitations. All right, so let's go back to the master branch, which is what we're on right now. And let's say that I want to, we're going to tag and we'll do a tag. Okay. And just add a tag and I'll say, okay, I want to tag this version, and I can say, you know, we'll call this version, we'll call it 1.0, oh boy, I'm showing my old real basic days there. Xojo 2014 R 2.1, so that tells me what version it is, and I don't have any plugins right now. So I'm just going to say that was version 1.0, and I last tested it with that particular version. I could even say the operating system if I wanted to, but I'm not going to bother with that today. Now let's see, we can copy parent. It's supposed to have selected this particular commit. So now I'm telling it to add a tag for that particular commit. Tags are not something that are essential, but again, they're handy to say. So now I could, when I'm in the master branch, and let's say the screen would be filled with commits, and I say, well, what was version 1.0? Now I'm version 10. If you selected this, it would change your view, and you could actually say, check out that version. Now is where it talks about, not related to detached heads, but now that I'm checking out a revision that's been tagged, or commit, this is where it's talking about detached head. It says, hey, you'll make your working copy, your local files. You won't be pointing to the branch tip anymore, which is the latest commit, which is that line right there. If you want to commit after this, as it explains here, you're going to have to branch or check out another one again. So basically, it's just letting you know that hey, okay, you're now back to a previous version. And now so the master repository is there. My working directory though is behind by one. And so now what we can say is, oh, it doesn't have the get ignore file. And it probably has this file that now is showing up because the get ignore file doesn't exist at the commit that I'm at. So that's why that file now appears. So let's restore our version back to where we were. So I'm going to check out the master branch again, and now we're back and we're golden. And now that file no longer shows because the get ignore file is now back to the latest commit that had it committed. I know that was a lot there. We'll talk more about that in the second part, but it might be a little more than we have time for today. But that's why you should come back. All right, remotes. Again, GitHub or Bitbucket. SourceTree has fantastic integration with it. You can bookmarks, host repositories. You can edit your accounts. You can change all sorts of integration here. I won't demo this, but if you're in the SourceTree already right now looking at it, this is where you can get started, and it's a very handy user interface. And checking them out is very, very simple. Very, very handy to use that. All right, so let's jump into lessons learned, but maybe we should stop, I guess, for some questions or any other items before we jump into the wrapping it up, Paul?
Yeah, there are a few questions I sent to your queue. Hopefully you can see them.
Yep. Yeah, let me get out. Okay, let's see what these are. All right, so okay. Okay, I'm not. All right, Christian, I'll try to see what you see here. I'm not sure. Well, the question, it looks like, do I always have all files revealed to coworkers if I'm sharing a project with a repository with others? Sure. Yeah, if they're not sensitive files for, I don't want to annoy or inundate my coworkers with, the way my user interface is set up. If I have different colors for or your IDE has a different layout or otherwise, because some people may like a different view, or in the Xojo IDE, I have some ways I like to set it up versus others. So there are some files you'll just want to ignore, but you always want to include all the files in the repository that somebody needs to build that project successfully. That's the key part. So ignore files that are not critical and they're most user specific, not for the project, but if you can't build the file, or rather, if you can't compile or build your project from the repository, I mean, some files are missing, those should be added to the repository at all times, because otherwise your coworkers are going to be kind of upset if they can't build a project. Use that, of course, with some good judgment if there are large files, but you may have to manage that in a different way. Oh, okay. Here's somebody who was mentioning Windows compared to Exam Diff Pro. Thank you. Thanks, Lance. That's a good suggestion. As you can tell, I'm mostly on OS 10 and Linux and Windows sometimes. Okay, we've got some other questions about. I'm scrolling through the questions here just to see if we covered them. Okay. So Dirk asks a good question about sharing code between projects and storing them in XML. That was actually one of my slides, but I pulled it because it was it's more involved. But you can store external items as XML for version control, but XML in binary really doesn't play well with the human eyeballs trying to scan for differences. Yes, you can do that, but Seth Veringer, I believe, from Bikini Software had a good article of how they manage to share code in their projects, and I agree with his stance. Initially, I was using external items in XML, and I had them in one project, and then I had another one. Well, the problem with doing that, having one project edit and update one, is that you've tested in that application, but if you don't then test your changes in another one, then you could potentially break another application. So they, and I do the same thing now as well. I have a separate repository for all my shared code and Xojo stuff, and I put it there, and I tag those with certain versions. And so then, and you can use external references and get really fancy and have it do a checkout from a particular repo and a different branch for versions of external items. That's an advanced topic, but that way you always have your project self-contained, and if you do have shared code items, you can commit those back to another repository and tag them with a version and state that your application has been tested against version 2.1 of shared code library named, cat dog, whatever you want. So I know that sort of touched on what you're asking there, but I wanted to mention that there as well. So, okay, thanks for the response on that one, Christian. And running low on time, so I should probably wrap up, but I think, let's see if I can show quickly something over. One of the really cool features in SourceTree, Paul's probably thinking, oh no, he's going to show more. Well, we're going to just for a second, we'll be very quick. It's a nice feature. The cherry pick feature is really pretty cool. So yeah, Kim, I appreciate you mentioning this. It is a nice feature. So let's say that you had some changes in, only a few changes in a particular file. You don't want to make all of them in the same single file. You don't want to commit the entire file. You just want to commit portions that you changed. Well, this is where you can change that. So let's say I could say Xojo developers. Well, oh, actually, yes, perfect. All right, so I'll try to change the size of that window, and now I like it centered. Sorry, it's the OCD in me. All right, so now it would be really centered if I was really OCD there. Okay, now I'm happy. All right, now we can go to quit. And in SourceTree, it'll show that window's been changed. And I say, whoa, I only wanted those. I don't really want to change the position just yet. I want to change this too. It's looking at it as staged. The file's probably not big enough. Ah, there we go. Okay. So I'm telling SourceTree to view smaller contexts of changes. And so you can say, in this window, I really only want to change the caption. I don't want to change the entire file. Instead, I want to change a portion of the file. So I can say stage the hello world change. And now it still says, oh, I still have these changes in the file of location, but right now I do want to stage the caption. So you can say updated caption of the hello world button. Okay, it's still called the hello button, but of course it says the caption has changed, so the name of the button is the same. Anyway, now it's committed that, and it still shows the changes left in the file. So that's a very nice, I believe that's called the cherry pick thing as well. I've used that a couple of times. It's very, I mean, SOURCETREE, they did a great job of implementing the UI to support that. So thanks for mentioning that one, Cam. That's a good idea. I'll review, make sure, see if we have anything else. Here for questions I'm reviewing. Yes, okay. All right. So, Paul, did you have anything else before we wrap up?
No, this was great. That last thing you showed with the cherry picking was awesome. I had no idea you could do that. I'm sure I will find that useful.
Okay, sure.
As Justin mentioned, this is part one of what has now become a two-part Git webinar, and we haven't officially scheduled part two, but I think probably it'll be in October. But we'll work out the details there, so keep an eye out on the webinar page for when that appears. And I don't see any further questions, so I want to thank everyone for attending this week, and I especially want to thank Justin for the impressive detail here on using Git, and I highly recommend that if people are not using Source Control System, by all means, take a look at this, play around with it. It's definitely worth their while.
Sure.
All right, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.